Right. So before I start, do we have anyone in the audience who has in the past or currently is trying to expand on the OMOP CDM, who wants to share their experience?
This is Andrew Williams, part of a couple of different efforts to where this is a question. And so whether or not to think of the work to bring in a new kind of data, for example, GIS data or genomic data or data on waveforms, whether that should be done in a way that is part of sort of a central canonical version of the CDM that's always the thing that everybody in the community uses, or is an optional piece that attaches but conforms to all the conventions, is a question in several of those areas. It was brought up earlier today as a topic without being resolved in the genomics work group. So it's an area I care passionately about, us as a community making progress on. I'm really glad you're doing this, Sonia. And I don't have experience in the sense of having resolved the issue, but I have experience in the sense of being a part of several efforts where that's a pressing question as to what that strategy ought to be.
So as well as the strategy, would you say the strategy is the biggest challenge for all the efforts you've been involved in?
I think so. I think it plays out in a little bit different ways. I won't speak for Christian. He gave some thoughts about the ways in which those strategies ought to be informed more by people developing tools than necessarily people involved in work on vocabularies or schema. And yeah, so that's an outgrowth of the conversation this morning in the genomics work group. Yes, it is a pressing issue to one extent or another in all of those different efforts.
Thank you. Anybody else with an experience they want to share on how to expand?
Yeah, this is Paul Nagy at Johns Hopkins. Yeah, I would echo Andrew's statements, and I spent a lot of time with medical imaging and deep learning efforts and trying to integrate that with EMR data. And I agree that it really depends on, I guess, we're trying to figure out what type of research questions are we trying to answer, and to find the right elbow in the curve of what level of complexity we want to be able to support in the data model.
Excellent. Thank you. That really makes sense, and I think I will speak on similar veins. So it's good that we are experiencing the same things. Any final comments from anyone before I share with you what we've done in clinical trials? Cool. I'll start, and please do stop me and let's interact as we go along. But let me stop here on this cover page. And it goes along with what you both were saying in terms of the strategy. I think it was important to build a team that really had different skills and brought their different skills to the table. Our technical heart, I have a team from the Hive and the Odysseus, and we have at least Maxime and Philippe I've seen here today already. And then we had other vendors like myself, but then we had a good mix of academia from different universities and research organizations, and some veterans, really important, like Andrea and Wojtek from OHDSI. And I think what was really important, it goes back to your point of strategy. What was really important for me was to bring in people from CDISC. For those of you who are not familiar with CDISC, I'm going to exaggerate to make a point, but or approximate. No, I think CDISC is to the clinical trial world what OHDSI is to the observational research world. There are many similarities between the two organizations, but CDISC has a series of standards, of industry standards, and some of them, like one that's called SDTM. The SDTM format is the mandatory data format for submitting clinical trial final data to the FDA. And it's either required or an optional format elsewhere in the world. And so for me, strategically, it was really important to bring them in because they could collaborate with those who know OMOP inside out and really see where the gaps were and where the opportunities were. So I wanted to mention that, and I know I've got several people from the group, and thank you for being here today. And what did you identify as the problem, and why do we have the group? As you can imagine, there's a big overlap between clinical trial data and observational data. And actually, before I continue, can I check that your screens have changed to a different slide? Do you see a slide that has got a title? What's the problem?
Yeah, what's the problem is the top of the slide.
I'm asking because it was giving me a little bit of hassle with sharing. So great, fantastic. Thank you. So as I was saying, there is an obvious overlap between clinical trial data and observational data in terms of, say, the lab measurements that are taken. But there is a significant gap, and two very big examples, as in they're significant, are the two that I mentioned there. So when it comes to adverse events, there really isn't a way to store that well in OMOP in terms of the adverse event severity, but also its causality. And also there isn't a clear way to store information about clinical trial arms. And so our mission became to allow adequate representation of clinical trial data and OMOP, in OMOP. And so with that, what we wanted to propose to the community to propose conventions for the CDM and vocabularies to allow that representation. To the strategy, we had from the outset two options. We could be very granular and really go all out and represent everything in clinical trial data in OMOP, but that would mean not just more comprehensive conventions and extensions, but it would also mean that it would impact Odyssey tools like Atlas. And that would not be a good win, because then you could get a lot of value from an ETL perspective, but then you couldn't use it. Very much to John's point in terms of research questions require Atlas queries, and therefore you'd be stuck. And so the other extreme would be to do almost nothing, as it was. So we landed on what I think is obvious, which is let's ensure that, yes, we have adequate and we still have a value add STTM to OMOP conversion, but we're ensuring minimum impact on things like Atlas. And the way we've done that is we say we don't need any new tables. We can continue with the tables that exist, and we do that on OMOP version 6. But then we follow the example of the oncology working group, and we have extensions, we have modifiers. And so this is what we've been doing for the first half of 2020. We submitted our proposals to the community in July, and if you haven't seen it, I'll gladly put a link in the chat at the end of this on the general channel, and please do review those proposals. We'd love to hear your views. And process is going on, and yes, we went to the symposium with this proposal as well. What are we doing is we eating our own dog food, as I believe you say in the US, which is now we're trying it out. We're using a publicly available clinical trial data database called Fuse, so it has synthetic data that is in the STTM format. And so we currently applying our conventions to that, which for a lot of discovery in terms of how to do mappings in White Rabbit, and so how to do the analysis in White Rabbit, how to do mappings in Rabbit in the Hat, and subsequently we're going to do the ETL work as well. So this is where we are. In terms of, some of you may be thinking, what's next? So we would like to assume that the Odyssey community will give us a thumbs up very, very soon. And then we want other people in the community to really try it out. And through that interaction, really get more and better conventions to bridge this gap that I mentioned at the beginning. We do have other thoughts in terms of, let's kind of put this upside down, and instead of doing STTM to OMOP, we could do the other direction. we could start looking at linked clinical trial data or look at registry data, but that is more in the future. As I say, for now, what we would like to see is the community to use our conventions and to really feedback and contribute to those. So that is really a summary of where we are. As I'll send you links on the general channel to our proposals and to our poster. But the proposals is perhaps the best document because it tells you the 8 areas that we're looking at. And as I say, not creating new tables, but suggesting there are some modifiers in order to capture that data that is normally not stored in OMOP. I wanted to stop there and ask for any questions or comments on our work in the clinical trial group.
This is Andrew again. I want to just emphasize one of the things I thought was good about the work you led here in the not only bringing in a CDM, but the effort to use conventions that were started in another area, in this case oncology, around modifiers and other things that have been understood to be required for that work, and applying them here rather than doing something idiosyncratically. And I think a strategy that doesn't look completely modular has to at least do that kind of thing, has to at least to look around what else is happening in the OHDSI community that might serve the needs of some domain that's been done for another domain, so that there isn't a constant proliferation of things. If you aren't going to create a separate thing that's bespoke for a new domain like clinical trials, you have to at least, as you so ably did, make sure that some things are being reused and their definitions being expanded to include the use cases that are promoting their reuse. So that's more of a comment than a question.
Cool. No, thank you. I appreciate it. And yes, I think we can't stress that enough. Is kind of use your fellow OHDSI members for support and support them in return. So for those of you who saw Craig saying that there is a clinical trials meeting this Friday, we meet every other Friday, and you're all welcome to come. But this particular Friday is dedicated to the oncology working group, because to Andrew's point, Andrew is part of both groups. We want to learn even more from their journey, so that'll be our forewarned, as you were, but also we can expand from their own work. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Christian, if you're talking, you're on mute.
I clicked it and then it didn't go away, and I clicked it again, but apparently it was just delayed, so I clicked it off again. This is a question. Hi, Sonia. If you go back on the slide deck, do you have somewhere, did you guys ever create practical use cases that you would like to test? The reason I'm asking is it's that, you know, it may look very obvious and trivial, because it's kind of like clinical data that we're talking about, but actually there are the observational data and the clinical data are collected for different purposes, and they are analyzed different ways, and they have different features. So did you guys say, okay, you know, if we could do this and we could put a bunch of clinical trial assets in there, this is what we could do? Do you have that kind of thing that you can test out whether you achieve this or not?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So kind of a use cases and what could this be put to good use? So I took over the group at the beginning of January last year, but Sean Doley was leading it up until then, and he did a great job at doing exactly that. So we put it out to the community what use cases there were, and from memory there was something like 18. So 18 things that could benefit from this kind of bridging the gap. And in the end, what we focused on was the SDTM to OMOP use case for the precise cases of it promotes collaboration, because then we could have standardized tools analyzing clinical trial data. And also something that Odysseus Medidata and Hive told us, sponsors, so farmers would come to them with this precise need, because they wanted to, by doing this, by converting STTM to OMOP, they wanted to optimize trial design. So those were the two things that we chose at the end of 2019 to continue with.
Yeah, I'm going to briefly talk there. We actually, this is Maxim, by the way, work with Sonia on the conventions and the rest of the group. So we indeed started with laying down these use cases. Why are we doing this? Why are we actually looking at this clinical trial data? And I actually found a slide which I presented at the beginning of this year at the CDISC conference. Let's see if I can share that. It might make things
Thank you.
Easier. You see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So, as Sonia said, there are two things. So, both using the real data for the clinical trial design. You can imagine you can use it in a patient enrichment phase for planning, for creating virtual patient cohorts, and to predict trial adherence. So that's really basically for the clinical trial design using existing real-world data sources. Then more the use case we are looking at is this right column, where we're linking real-world data and clinical trial data. So that you can define a cohort that you can run across both clinical trial data and the real-world data, so that they're harmonized and interoperable. Then a more advanced is to use the clinical trial data actually as a source of real-world evidence. Let's say that you group all the placebo patients together and use that as a group where no intervention was done. So it's like a actual observational data. And then there are some other things like cross-clinical study analysis and enabling real-world data assets to support interventional analysis. So this is actually also what I'm interested in, maybe from this group. In general, using study data in OMOP, the OHDSI tools. There is more and more interest in that. So not only clinical trial data, but also registries and study data in general. Especially Voitech, I'm not sure whether Voitech is on the line, has expressed a lot of interest in combining this effort in a new group actually, where we take learnings from both the clinical trial working group and also the, for instance, the UK Biobank working group, where we're looking specifically at one data set, a registry data set, to convert that to OMOP. And there are also some specifics apply because the data structure is completely different, collected very differently to observational data. And the OMOP data model doesn't always, is not always very well suited for that. For instance, we created the new history of concepts with, actually the vocabulary team did, but the UK Biobank mapping was one of the mapping of the study was the reason they did that. So we're saying like it's not just the history of, but the history of 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So we can specify that a bit more in case we don't have an actual date. So
Maxime, this and Sonia, this may just be my ignorance in this space, but how available is clinical trial data? Like, I'm sitting here thinking about these use cases, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, how available is this data? Like, for example, I know that Johnson & Johnson, being an employee, like that there is some clinical trial data that is released, at the end of certain clinical trials. But I thought it was the case that there are only a few, a few companies that actually do that, and kind of how feasible is it that this would actually be used? Because there's a reason that STCM or whatever it's called is the standard, because that's what the FDA requires for reporting, and CDISC, as you said, is the standard for other reasons. So how feasible is it that this could be worked in there?
I can give one example at least, a tool called DataSphere, where actually multiple pharma companies are, I think, pre-competitively sharing these trial data. I think it's actually feasible. Yeah.
Some of the other context. Oh, go ahead, Sonia.
No, I think you're both right. You know, it is available, but with restrictions, and so I have no doubt that, you know, if people take our conventions and start using it, they are going to be able to share the results with us, with the rest of the community. They can tell us how well it works, and they can give us perhaps aggregated summary data. But I appreciate your point, Claire, that they won't be able to share the whole thing. But as what we looked at, so I mentioned Fuse. Fuse is our public data set that we're using, and then we're looking at what others we could use in our efforts. DataSphere is one of them, that Maxime was
Nicola, I have to.
Sorry.
Sorry.
The other one, Norris. The other one that we're currently looking into is Vivli. I don't know if you're familiar with Vivli, Claire.
No, not at all.
Do we have Tom Walpole on the line, by the way? Yeah. So Tom is the person in the group who's really interacting with them. They are, how should I put it? They are, I like how Vostex describes them. They are like an intermediate. So they have got connections with different sponsors, with different farmers, and they provide a safe research environment. So people like ourselves, these conventions, we would like to explore it on some research clinical trial data in STTM. Are there any sponsors who will share their data? And so we submit an application, and they will consider it. And then they will give us access. We can't download the data, so they will share it if they accept our proposal. They will share their data in the Vivli, that company's research environment, and then we will do our ETL there in the environment. And then we won't be able to share all the data, but again, we can provide a summary to the rest of the OHDSI community. That it sounds really good in one hand and really cumbersome in the other. I think we're going to discover over the months that come how that will happen. Then the question is also, not only to your point, Claire, will they accept our request? Will they share the data? But also, how good is the data? Because those of you on the call who know a little bit about STTM, you know that it's not a rigid format, and people can implement it in various ways. And so we are currently looking at how can we assess how good an STTM implementation this database is, which will add a different level of complexity. So very long answer between Maxime and mine, but hopefully that answers your question, Claire.
Yeah, I want to add a couple things to in addition to those publicly available clinical trial data sets, which are really important. The NIH and other funding agencies in the U.S. are explicitly naming OMOP as a part of Data Coordinating Center funding announcements, saying we want to integrate. There's NIH Data Commons, there's a genomic data, there's all these areas where the value of harmonized data for data that's been collected by NIH funded work is people want to promote reuse of it, fair principles for data management of it, and so on. So that's one additional thing. And it's a really important opportunity for us as a community to be able to respond to that and say we can not only get these EHR and claims and other kinds of data for it, but there's ways to link those within a data coordinating center for the clinical trial data, or at least some large portion of them, for all the other kinds of reuse purposes that are there. In addition to that, I think EHRs are increasingly enabling the collection of trial data. So OHDSI members that are at healthcare delivery organizations that are using Epic or Cerner or one of these other EHRs that are essentially removing the redundant need for CRFs to collect your data, but are doing that within the EHR and are marking out who's been a part of a trial and so on and so forth. It's increasingly going to be a Venn diagram where there's some overlap between the collection of data specifically for trials and clinical data. So I just wanted to add that to those two important large sort of repositories of clinical trial data that Sonia and Maxim mentioned. Yeah,
that's a very good point. And I don't know if Kristen is with us or whether she's in a different breakout room, but Kristen and yourself and Isaiah in our group also mentioned collaboration with N3C. Just to let everyone know, we discussed this in the group. And then in the end, we thought, so N3C are looking at COVID and they're looking at both observational data and clinical trial data. And in the end, we thought we were a little bit too novice. We just started with this exercise. So we thought it would be too premature to interact with N3C. But that's the sort of thing that we would like to mature to, for sure.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So I don't know if Kristen is on or not, but I'm on the leadership of that. And there isn't a lot of trial data in N3C yet. There's an effort to try and be useful to people who are doing trial design and so on, but it's not one of the major data components that are available within N3C yet, though there's some talk about how to do that, and particularly for the pharma groups that are starting to interact with N3C to make things available. But so far it hasn't been in the context where that data would be harmonized to OMOP as the rest of the observational data has yet. So we're not, the clinical trial group is not lagging behind anything that's happening in N3C, just to reassure you.
Cool. I feel less guilty because I thought this sounded like a great opportunity, but no, we were just too early. We concluded as a group. Cool. Now, there are quite a few people, or a few people from the group here other than myself and Maxime and Andrew. So if I pick on Chris or Philip or Katie or Saya, any of them, so as we were going through the analysis of views or the writing of the conventions, any other challenges you wanted to share with the rest of the group here and how we overcame it? I know you're not a shy bunch, which is why I'm putting the question out there.
Hi, it's Katie. I guess one interesting challenge to call out has been how, and this is ongoing, obviously, how to collaborate on the development of the ETL specs asynchronously. So we have GitHub which is good for coding, but then kind of the white rabbit outputs and more of the documentation aspects. We've used GitHub, but it's not exactly designed for that sort of thing. So that could be an interesting thing to discuss as a larger community, how to collaborate on specifications, documentation outside of the code realm.
That's a fair point, and kind of rookies like myself and you, we were doing everything in rabbit in a hat, but then we've got people like Philip in the Odysseus who were doing something else, isn't it? So Philip, you did a great job, to Katie's point, in trying to harmonize everyone's specifications. From that experience and elsewhere, is there any heads up we want to give to the rest of the team here? I'm assuming Phil is still with us.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Frankly, I think we work pretty well on our specification, although we haven't run through all the tables that we have in SDTM dataset, and from this point of view, we are kind of on an early stage, but we try to push it forward so that I have something that anyone can publicly download and run on their machine and have some results to inspect how we do this and maybe apply to their data sets and maybe be more interested in creating and developing something like that at their environments. So at this time, we're like looking for an environment to continue our development of an ETL process. So maybe here we should ask community how we can do this, or the best way to get such an environment.
I think that's a great question. Do we still have Christian with us? Christian, are you still with us?
So I'm going to jump in and talk over Christian, because I think you guys have brought up a good point in that thinking about how we move forward and expanding the use cases of the OMOP model. And we've seen in the past, one way is to actually create, additions like that oncology extension, or really the episode tables you're talking about. That was one way in which we can start to support more types of data, like clinical trial data, like oncology data, like registry data. And so what I really appreciate about what you guys have done is you've said, these are conventions we believe you should follow to take data from the SDTM format and get it into the OMOP format. And so I really like that you guys kind of went that path, because I think it makes it more tangible for people, and then it requires less on the side of the community to say, oh, well, if you want to use clinical trial data or map it to the model, you have to add in this new column or be on a new version of the CDM. So I really like that approach you took, and I wonder, like, thinking kind of zooming out a little bit, like perhaps there are other models we would want to support in that way. So like talking about M3C, they've built workflows to get pCoordinate data, ACT data, and Trinetics data into the OMOP model, and perhaps that's a way we should be moving. Is other types of data that are these other models. We already have ways that you can get it into OMOP.
Cool, I like that. Thank you. And again, to Andrew's point and John at the beginning, that was because we thought we would follow a group of the oncology group that we saw work so well. So it's good to see that you approve of that as well. In the environment, is this something that you get oftentimes, Claire, from other teams? And how do you solve that?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit in the middle. Can you restate that?
So on the question of sharing environment, so once we do these conventions and we want to try things out like we are doing, so doing, like Katie was saying, doing specifications separately can be kind of difficult, but we found a way to consolidate them. Ideally, no, we have now two options. Either we all work separately on our computers in terms of ETL code, or in an ideal world, we would have an environment within OHDSI where we could do that. Is the latter something that happens in other groups, or is that something that as a community we haven't been doing?
No, as a community, we have not been doing any kind of shared environment because that costs money, and we have very little of that. So, we have recently gotten some grants, but some of I'm fuzzy on the details. Craig, you might know a little bit more about the FDA grant. It sounds like it's a little bit more around education, and perhaps wouldn't be so supportive of us building this type of environment to work on, say, mapping clinical trial data. But it is a good point, and it's one that we've tried to get around in the past. And as of now, the best option we have is unfortunately working on our own machines. That's why I was thinking it's a lot easier to do that when we're all talking about another model. And we've used the Cynthia data in the past. There's always there's some sort of synthetic data out there that we can use, like you guys were using Fuse. I'm sure we could get, some sort of synthetic data that we could all work with in another model format like pCoordinate and work on it together. But right now we're mostly just collaborating through GitHub.
Cool.
I just wanted to, and it's been a great discussion, Claire, concerning the grant. I think you're pretty accurate about your assessment, but I'll check in a little bit on that and make sure. But we are at 12 o'clock. This has been a great conversation. Hoping to post this and the other ones, so you can only make one. Hopefully you can catch some of the discussion that happened on the other ones. But Sonia, thanks so much for leading this. Thank you to everybody who joined, and hopefully we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for the great discussion.
Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.